There's a moment that happens again and again in Shakespeare spaces these days. I've encountered it myself at conferences lately. Someone says, I got into Shakespeare through fanfiction, or TikTok, or a modern retelling. And sometimes the room goes quiet because we all know the unspoken response. Does that really count? Good morrow, good listeners, and welcome back to the Shakespeare podcast with me, Koel Chatterjee. Today, I want to talk about fandom and academia, not as opposites, but as two cultures that keep circling each other, borrowing from one another, and sometimes refusing to admit it. And more importantly, what happens when they actually respond to each other? We often treat William Shakespeare like a statue in a park, unmoving, prestigious, and untouchable. That's the Shakespeare of academia. Academia has long imagined a particular kind of Shakespeare reader, a reader who is historically informed, emotionally restrained, suspicious of identification, and careful not to impose modern values. This model comes from a very real scholarly anxiety. If we read Shakespeare incorrectly, we lose authority over him. Douglas Lanier talks about this in Shakespeare and Modern Popular Culture, where he argues that Shakespeare operates as a cultural myth, a figure whose value depends on being treated as special, elevated, and scarce. But fandom threatens that scarcity. Henry Jenkins gives us one of the most useful frameworks here. In Textual Poachers, written in 1992, Jenkins argues that fans are not passive consumers but active participants who take texts apart and rebuild them to meet emotional and political needs. When you apply this to Shakespeare, something fascinating happens. Because Shakespeare is already public domain, endlessly adapted, and structurally incomplete, which means fandom isn't violating the text, it's exploring the same openness scholars rely on. Today we're looking at the tension between the linen bound Shakespeare and the tag cloud Shakespeare. And who has the right to rewrite the bard? Does an AO3 author have as much claim to Hamlet as a PhD student at Oxford? Let's start in the ivory tower. In academia, Shakespeare is often approached through textual criticism. For centuries, scholars have obsessed over the true version of the plays. Academia prioritizes intent and context. To understand the academic right to the text, we have to look at textual bibliography. In your local bookstore, Hamlet is one book. In academia, Hamlet is a ghost. Because we don't have Shakespeare's original manuscripts, we rely on the first folio and various quartos. We have the first quarto, Q1, of 1603, the second quarto, Q2, of 1604, and the first folio, F1, of 1623. Scholars like Paul Werstein or Sir Brian Vickers spent decades debating the bad quarto. For example, in Q1, the to be or not to be speech happens much earlier in the play than in the folio. Also, in Q1, the line is to be or not to be, there's the point. To an academic, this isn't just a typo. It's a puzzle about authorial intent. Was Q1 a memorial reconstruction by a greedy actor? Or was it perhaps an early draft? The academic right to Shakespeare is earned through this rigorous policing of the borders, trying to find where the actor ends and the author begins. They argue that if we don't protect the text from corruption, we lose the real Shakespeare. In this world, authority is derived from historical accuracy or an understanding of the socio-political climate of Elizabethan England, from linguistic precision or the ability to analyze iambic pentameter and early modern English, and the canon, the idea that there is a correct way to interpret these characters based on the text. Therefore, to academia, rewriting Shakespeare is often seen as adaptation, a secondary craft. The original is the sun, and everything else is just a planet reflecting its light. In fandom, Shakespeare isn't a historical figure, he's a sandbox. Fans utilize a concept called transformative work. They argue that the text is not a finished monument, but a conversation. So, on AO3, the corruption of the text is the whole point. If you search the William Shakespeare Works tag on AO3, you'll see the taxonomy of fandom. It's not organized by date or genre, but by affect, how the story makes you feel. Let me tell you about 3 specific transformative examples you'll find in these archives. The first, probably the most popular one, is the fix-it fic. In Romeo and Juliet, the tragedy relies on a missed letter. On AO3, there are hundreds of stories where the friar's message, or messenger, simply arrives on time. To a scholar, this ruins the play. To a fan, it explores the character's potential for happiness. The second example is the epistolary fix. Fans often write missing scenes via letters. They use the sonnets not as standalone poems, but as text messages between characters. This mirrors the academic work of Don Patterson, who analyzes the sonnet's sequence, but fans treat it as plot. And lastly, we have the modern setting, where the characters have no powers. This is a huge trope. What is Macbeth if it's set in a corporate boardroom, for example? What is the Tempest if Prospero is just a grumpy tech CEO on a private island? By stripping away the bardolatry, the fancy language, and the doublets, fans argue they are getting closer to the emotional truth of the characters than any history book could. When we talk about fandom, we're not just talking about enthusiasm. We're talking about spaces or places where people gather to respond to stories, argue with them, rewrite them, and keep them alive long after the original text has ended. Historically, fandom spaces have always existed. They just weren't always digital. People used to copy out favorite passages by hand, write continuations in the margins, stage amateur performances, and circulate letters arguing over characters. What's changed is visibility. A fandom space is any environment where readers become creators, interpretation becomes conversation, and emotional response is valued rather than hidden. These spaces prioritize use over authority. The question isn't what does this text mean? It's what can we do with it? That's where AO3 comes in. AO3 stands for Archive of Our Own. It's a non-profit, fan-run archive created in 2009 by the Organization for Transformative Works in response to fan fiction being deleted, monetized, or dismissed elsewhere online. The name matters. Archive of Our Own is a statement. These stories deserve preservation. They deserve care. They deserve to exist outside corporate or academic control. It's important to note here that AO3 isn't social media. There's no algorithm deciding what you see, no ads, no pressure to perform virality. Instead, everything is searchable and archived. Works are organized through tags, characters, relationships, themes, emotional states, tropes. These tags aren't imposed from above either. They're created by users, which means they reflect what readers actually care about. AO3 treats fan works as creative, intentional, and worthy of long term access. A fic written 10 years ago is just as findable as one written yesterday. That archival structure makes AO3 less like Instagram and more like a library. A very messy, emotionally honest library. This is where it gets especially interesting for Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare is public domain, AO3 hosts modern retellings, sequels, fix-it fic where tragedies are undone, queer reinterpretations, alternate universes like schools, gangs, corporations, historical resets. In other words, AO3 becomes a record of how Shakespeare is being read now. Not taught, not preserved, but used. It shows us which characters people linger on, which relationships demand more time, which endings readers refuse to accept. That's not disrespect, that's engagement. For instance, let's take another look at Hamlet on AO3. It's one of the most active Shakespeare fandoms on the archive. It isn't about untangling the plot, it's about what the play refuses to resolve. So you see examples of Hamlet and Horatio surviving and dealing with the aftermath. You see grief treated as something that lingers, not something that ends with the curtain. You see the ghost reframed as trauma rather than a supernatural device. This isn't confusion, it's dissatisfaction with emotional closure. With Romeo and Juliet, AO3 tells a different story. There are endless modern AUs, schools, gangs, rival corporations, and an overwhelming number of fix-it fic. Juliet survives, Juliet chooses herself, Juliet rejects the romance that killed her. This is fandom responding to centuries of romanticizing teenage death and saying, actually, no. And in Macbeth, AO3 often shifts perspective to Lady Macbeth, not as a villain, but as someone navigating ambition, complicity, and consequence. The supernatural fades, the psychology sharpens, which tells us something important. AO3 reads Shakespeare as character driven, not plot driven. This brings us to the big question: who has the right to rewrite Shakespeare? Academia sometimes views fandom with a patronizing eye, calling it self indulgent. Scholars often argue that fandom ignores historical specificity. It collapses early modern and modern identities, and it risks anachronism. And this critique isn't meaningless. Early modern sexuality, for example, does not map neatly onto modern labels. Alan Bray and Eve Kozowski Sedgwick both remind us that early modern intimacy operated through different social logics: friendship, patronage, honor. So when fandom says Hamlet and Horatio are in love, academia replies, careful, that language didn't exist yet. But here's the problem, because academia is also using modern frameworks. Terms like identity, subjectivity, psychology, trauma, none of these are early modern either. When we talk about Hamlet's depression or Ophelia's mental health, we're already translating the text into modern emotional vocabularies. Fandom just does it without pretending neutrality. As Christy Desmet argues in her work on Shakespearean appropriation, adaptation often reveals what criticism tries to conceal: that all reading is interested reading. Fandom doesn't claim objectivity, it claims attachment. Nowhere is this tension clearer than in queer readings. Academia historically framed queer Shakespeare through homosocial bonds, intense friendship, affective intimacy. But Sedgwick's Between Men was radical precisely because it showed how desire circulates without naming itself. Fandom takes that insight and says, okay, but what if we name it anyway? This isn't ignorance, it's intervention. Fandom responds to the limits of academic caution by asking who benefits from never making queerness explicit. Moreover, fandom often views academia as gatekeeping, keeping the plays locked in a refrigerated room where they can't breathe. Academia often views the text as a primary source, a fossil to be preserved. Fandom views the text as a protocol, a set of instructions for a performance that never ends. At this point, it's worth pointing out as well that Shakespeare was a fan and rarely came up with his own plots. Romeo and Juliet was based on Arthur Brooke's poem. Hamlet was based on a Norse legend. Shakespeare was the original transformative creator. He took existing IP, or intellectual property, changed the ending, added some side characters, and punched up the dialogue. If we hold Shakespeare to the standards of some modern academic purists, Shakespeare himself would be disrespecting the source material. Richard Burt, in Shakespeare After Mass Media, argues that Shakespeare's cultural survival depends on repetition, degradation, and remix. In other words, Shakespeare lasts because people keep experimenting with him. Fan fiction doesn't betray Shakespeare's practice, it mirrors it. Ultimately, then, academia and fandom are two sides of the same coin: obsession. A scholar writing a 400-page monograph on the use of thee versus you, and a fan writing a 400-page slow burn romance between Beatrice and Benedict are doing the same thing. They're both looking at Shakespeare and saying, I'm not finished with you yet. So, who wins? The truth is, they need each other. Academia provides the tools, the definitions of peripeteia and anagnorisis that allows us to understand why these stories work. But fandom provides the blood. Fandom ensures that these characters remain people rather than case studies. This podcast, in fact, exists in this overlap. It refuses the idea that seriousness requires distance, joy undermines rigor, and love invalidates critique. Fandom teaches us why Shakespeare matters. Academia teaches us how he works. You don't have to choose. I certainly didn't. When a teenager writes a modern day high school AU of Othello on AO3, they are participating in the exact same tradition as the Royal Shakespeare Company. They are asserting that these stories are universal enough to be changed. So when we ask who gets to speak for Shakespeare, the answer isn't universities, fandom platforms, or podcasts like this one. It's anyone willing to stay with the text long enough to argue with it. Shakespeare doesn't need protection, he needs conversation. And that conversation is already happening in lecture halls, in footnotes, and in fic tags. So, if you're listening to this and you come from academia, I'd love you to ask yourself, what readings do I dismiss because they care too openly? And if you come from fandom, I'd love for you to ask, what scholarship might deepen what I already feel? If you've ever written fic, bookmarked work on AO3, or fallen into Shakespeare through a non traditional route, like Taylor Swift, for example. I'd love to hear about it. You can message the podcast, comment on this episode, or share the Shakespeare text that fandom helped unlock for you. Because Shakespeare doesn't belong to one space, he belongs to the conversation. And if you're interested in doing a deep dive into Shakespeare and fandom, I'd suggest looking up Shakespeare's fans, adapting the bard in the Age of Media Fandom by Jonathan H. Pope. The Shakespeare Multiverse Fandom as Literary Praxis by Louise Geddes and Valerie M. Faisal, and Shakespearean Celebrity in the Digital Age Fan Cultures and Remediation by Anna Blackwell. I'll put up a more exhaustive reading list on my Substack page, so you might want to subscribe to the Substack. That's it for today's episode. For those of you following me on the Shakespeare podcast, I'll be back next week with a review of Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, which is a retelling of The Tempest. And the week after that, I'll be back here with an interview with Elizabeth Wright, who has just wrapped up a PhD where she has written an adaptation of Love's Labour's Lost, which sounds fascinating. You're not going to want to miss that one. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me today as much as I enjoyed speaking with you.